Sometimes people who lived a long time ago leave such an impression that they are remembered and talked about to this day. Today we're going to learn about some remarkable people who lived during the American Revolution. Here we have William Blount, who was born in 1749 and who died in 1800. I developed an interest in Mr. Blount when I found a newspaper clipping about him in a folder at the Scott family collection. Finding a newspaper clipping is not that unusual here at the collection, but this particular clipping was especially interesting due to its age. It was printed in 1797. The clipping included political commentary discussing a thrilling news story about William Blount, who was one of the first two senators from the state of Tennessee. Apparently, Senator Blount had just been exposed as the head of a conspiracy to start a war with Spain. His goal was to return land held by Spain back to the English and to improve his own financial situation. To understand the significance of the clipping, we need to know a bit more about Senator Blount. William Blount is an interesting example of a man who found it difficult to decide which side he was on. He was born into a well-to-do family, and he was at first a loyalist, opposing the regulator movement here in North Carolina. Then he changed sides and served as a patriot in the Revolutionary War. After the war, he was active in public service and was a signer of the Constitution. After being elected one of the first two United States senators from Tennessee, a state he helped to bring into the Union, he was expelled from the Senate for trying to start a war with Spain. He returned to Tennessee, where he was still very popular, and served in their state senate until his death in 1800. Meet Anne Ross White. Anne Ross White was born in 1734 and died in 1819. She was born in Delaware, as was her husband Stephanius, and they lived in Philadelphia before moving to the Hawfields. Anne and Stephanius are the ancestors of several large local families, including the Whites and the Scotts. They got a good head start on this by having 11 children. So this couple had many descendants to keep their memory alive. But there is a bit more to this story. Anne and Stephanius were both buried in the graveyard of Hawfields Presbyterian Church, located south of Mebane, North Carolina. Here is Anne's tombstone. I am sorry we do not have a photograph of her, but photography did not come to the United States until several decades after she died. We see that her name was Anne Ross. She was born in Wilmington, Delaware, and she was 85 years old when she died. But what is this? Relative of Betsy Ross. The Betsy Ross who made the first American flag, the woman who stitched her way into American history. What is odd about this is that Betsy Ross did not become a part of American folklore until after 1870, when one of her grandsons started promoting her significance. So how did Anne Ross White know about this connection? Well, it turns out that one of Anne's daughters, Susan White, married Samuel Mebane, who was either the nephew or the cousin of Alexander Mebane Jr. And in 1795, 5 months before he passed away, Alexander Mebane Jr. married a woman named Anne Claypool. As it turns out, Anne was a relative of John Claypool, who was the third husband of Betsy Ross, or Elizabeth Ashburn, as she was known at the time. But what about someone who never married and never had children? Who is there to pass on their story? Well, you might be surprised. Meet John Ackes Jr., who died at the age of 19 on November 15, 1775. Although John never married or had children, he's a member of the family trees of both the Ackes and the Scott families. John was born in Virginia in 1756. He lost his life in what is now called the Battle of Kemp's Landing, or the skirmish at Kempsville. The conflict took place over a 2-day period. November 14 and 15, 1775, and was reported in the issue of the Virginia Gazette we see here. A group of militiamen from Princess Anne County in the province of Virginia engaged in fighting with British troops under the command of John Murray, Lord Dunmore, who was at that time the colonial governor of Virginia. The Patriots lost this battle, and John Ackus was killed, making him the first person to be killed in battle during the American Revolution in Virginia. For a person who died so long ago and at such a young age, John has become a significant part of Virginia folklore. His story is well known among members of the sons and daughters of the American Revolution, people who know a lot about history and genealogy. Last November, an entire day was devoted to the story of Kemp's Landing. Both sides of the conflict were represented by reenactors who interpreted and staged a battle for the many onlookers. What was once Kempsville is now Virginia Beach, Virginia. Meet Nathaniel Greene Carr. Family lore indicates that Nathaniel was related on his mother's side to Nathanael Greene, the famous Revolutionary War general. He was born in 1741 and died in 1826. Nathaniel was born in Pennsylvania, moved to Randolph County, North Carolina as a young man, and finally settled in the Alamance community in Greensboro. He married a widow named Margaret Graham Barrett in 1785. We know about Nathaniel's Revolutionary War service because in 1845 his widow, then 89 years old, found out about an act of Congress allowing veterans and their widows to apply for a pension benefit. Margaret filed the detailed affidavit we see here to the effect that her husband had served enough time in the war effort in various capacities for her to qualify for a pension based on his service record. Her son Samuel visited Randolph County in search of evidence in the form of testimony or written records. He did not find much at this point, so long after the war ended. As proof of her identity, Margaret provided family records from her personal copy of the Bible. It looks like her request for the pension was denied based on her lack of paperwork, which she said was lost in a fire maliciously set by a loyalist. Nathaniel and Margaret were the ancestors in the family trees of the Carr, White, and Scott families. Meet Samuel Lawrence Scott. Samuel Lawrence Scott is a patriarch of the Scott family of the Hawfields. We are fortunate to know a lot about him as he figures in the family trees of many descendants. He and his wife Nancy had 7 children, 2 of whom were the patriarchs of big families, John Scott of Graham, North Carolina, and Henderson Scott of the Hawfields. Samuel was born in 1764, late to have been active in the Revolutionary War. But here's an official record from the United States Revolutionary War Burial Index. The record identifies him as a Revolutionary War soldier. We know more about Samuel from his will than his war effort, but whatever he did for the war effort must have taken place towards the end of the war rather than at the beginning. And here's another interesting document that I think pertains to Samuel Scott of the Hawfields. This is a land claim or grant for acreage in the western part of North Carolina, east of the Mississippi, now in Tennessee. It awards Samuel a parcel of land that is right next to land owned by what appears to be Samuel Mebane, a relative by marriage. Samuel Mebane did move with his family to Tennessee, so this interpretation does seem plausible. Alexander Mebane, Jr. Alexander Mebane Sr. and his family migrated from Pennsylvania to North Carolina around the same time as the Scotts, and the two families have intermarried over the years. It is thought that the first wedding between the two families took place in the 1700s. All 6 of pioneer Alexander Mebane's sons were soldiers. They included William, James, Alexander Jr., Robert, John, and David. We know the most about Alexander Jr. and Robert, so we will focus on their stories. Alexander Mebane Jr. was born in or around 1744. Before the war, he was a successful businessman and active in public service. He was a delegate to the 5th North Carolina Provincial Congress held in Halifax during November and December of 1776. Alexander Jr. was very active during the Revolutionary War. His first two assignments were as colonel in the Southern Orange County Regiment of Militia, and then as colonel over the Orange County Regiment of Militia. After 1780, Alexander was appointed as Commissary General for the state of North Carolina with the rank of Brigadier General. During this period of time, Alexander was in Hillsborough when Governor Thomas Burke was captured by a group of Tories under David Fanning. Alexander had his Paul Revere moment when he escaped and made his way to the Hawfields, warning the citizens that the raiders were nearby. Later, he served as Colonel of the Horse for the Hillsborough District, and then as General of the Hillsborough District. After the war, Alexander Mebane Jr. attended the conventions in Hillsborough in 1788 and in Fayetteville in 1789, which considered ratification of the United States Constitution. He also served in the North Carolina House of Commons from 1787 to 1792. He was elected to the Third United States Congress in 1792, and he was one of the original trustees of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Although he only lived 50 years, Alexander Mebane Jr. packed quite a lot into 5 short decades. He helped our country to become a new nation, was a founder of one of the 2 oldest public universities in the United States, and even had a town named after him. And here we have Robert Mebane. Alexander Mebane's brother Robert accompanied him to the 5th North Carolina Provincial Congress in Halifax. Robert was already active in the militia, so it comes as no surprise that during the meeting he was appointed Lieutenant Colonel of the 7th Regiment of the Continental Army. His service took him up north to Pennsylvania and New Jersey for a few years before returning him to North Carolina. He was a brave and skillful soldier who was mentioned by name in several letters written by General George Washington during December of 1778. In an odd coincidence, we find that Robert served alongside William Blount, who was serving as paymaster of the 3rd Regiment at the same time that Robert was an officer in that unit. At the time of his death, a few days before Lord Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown, Robert was only 36 years old, unmarried, and childless. So who was left to tell Robert's story? In 1832, the United States government offered pensions to living veterans of the Revolutionary War or their widows. A number of veterans, including Robert's younger brother John, described Robert's service in their pension applications. The picture we get of him was a brave officer and leader who gave his life for the cause of freedom. We believe he was buried where he fell, in northern Chatham County. So this last subject is a work in progress. I mentioned that Samuel Scott was very young to have served in the Revolutionary War, so it would be of interest to find out who Samuel's parents were and how they were affected by the conflict. The latest they could have been born would be the 1740s. Some genealogies say that Samuel's parents were James Scott and Nancy Mebane, a sister to Alexander Mebane Jr. Others say that his parents were John Scott and Elizabeth Mebane, also a sister to Alexander Mebane Jr. What is frustrating here is that the names James Scott and John Scott appear in many local records from the Revolutionary War period and beyond. These records include land grants, pension applications, and wills, but so far we have not been able to connect any of these records to Samuel Scott and his descendants. And we don't know if Samuel had any brothers or sisters. So these mysteries present challenges to the historian, but when they are resolved, the results are so rewarding. The work continues, but our program must come to a close. Thank you for watching.